This is really, it's kind of a hoot to be here, I have to say. I may be the only person in the room not having PTSD at this moment sitting in Kent Hall. I've heard many stories of friends who heard that I was going to be speaking here. But as an economics major, somehow or other, I never made it to this particular room. But I'm very delighted to be here to talk to you today about something that a lot of people think is kind of an earth-shaking moment in our history, for better or worse, as they say, this issue of what happens when gay people get married. Now, we have seen, this is actually an old map, I haven't had a chance to update it. There are actually now 7 countries, with another one on its way, that actually give gay couples the full right to marry. The Netherlands was the first in 2001, and I'm going to talk a lot about that country in a few minutes. But then you can see kind of the other list, and actually there are now so many countries that give same-sex couples some kind of rights that actually I don't even have room on this PowerPoint slide for it. But it's something that's almost completely covered Western Europe at this point, with the exception of some of the southern regions like Italy and Greece, and I'm trying to think of there, and Austria perhaps is one of the other biggest countries that still does not cover same-sex couples. Here in the US, things are moving along, not quite so quickly, but we do have 5 states plus the District of Columbia that allow same-sex couples to marry. And one of those states, of course, is a neighboring state, your friends here in Iowa. Now, something more than a quarter of people in America live in a state in which gay couples either have the right to marry or have the right to some kind of legal status that comes with pretty much the same package of legal rights and benefits as marriage. So this is something that actually is moving a little bit more quickly in our country than we realize, even though we think of it as being mostly a New England thing, with the exception of Iowa. Now, in my first book, which Greg mentioned, I was thinking about marriage as an economist would. And one of the first things that you hear when you hear this debate is, you know, think of all the benefits. Think of the 1,138 benefits of marriage that the Government Accountability Office has counted that are just in the federal tax code alone. These include things like Social Security benefits, a variety of tax benefits ranging from no estate tax on transfers to a spouse to getting your employer-provided health care coverage without it being taxed from the federal side of things at any rate. So there are a whole bunch of these things that you can think of as being financial benefits. A couple of New York Times reporters this last fall tried to add all of those up to see what difference that made. And they looked at couples just in the New York region, and we, a colleague and I, helped feed some information to them. And they actually did a pretty careful job. The worst case scenario was an almost $500,000 and almost a $500,000 difference in costs for being a same-sex couple if you compared them to a similar couple that is a different-sex couple and is allowed to actually get married. And not everybody would actually lose that much over the course of a relationship or a lifetime, but that adds up, right? I mean, $500,000, you could probably even send your kid to the University of Chicago now for that. You could certainly buy a very nice house in most parts of the country, and you would have a pretty healthy savings account for your retirement, right? So this is potentially a very large economic, financial effect on same-sex couples. Now, economists, look at all those benefits and we say, well, that's not really the real economic benefit of marriage. We actually think of the true economic benefits of marriage as, stemming from the fact that marriage at least comes with the intention, let's put it this way, of there being a long-term relationship, a commitment to staying together for a long time. And once you have that, then I think you can get a lot of very clearly economic benefits out of that, whether it's thinking about kind of the classic Gary Becker approach, one of our professors here, that it can lead to increased specialization of labor and greater efficiency in the household. It can reduce transactions costs. It can lead to, from a more feminist perspective, it can lead to more provision of caring labor, the kind of work that you don't get paid to do, but actually makes a big difference in most people's lives, and several other kinds of other ways of thinking about marriage as an economic status, as something that's good not just for the couple, and it is good for the couple, but also good in a larger social sense as well. So thinking about this as an economist is something that I still continue to do. As Greg mentioned, I was a witness in the Prop 8 case out in California where they were, actually the case is still going on. The question was, what is the economic harm to couples of not actually being allowed to marry? And that's something that I testified to. But when it comes to thinking about the bigger picture on this issue, there came a point in time when I realized that sometimes economics is just actually not enough. So when I finally got my first sabbatical about, I guess it's about 8 years ago now, I decided to go to the first place that allowed same-sex couples to get married, to start, kind of thinking about some new research project. And that led me to the Netherlands. Now, if you remember, I know there's at least one person from Massachusetts who lives in Massachusetts now. He was here. In 2003, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts ruled that same-sex couples should be allowed to marry according to our state's constitution. And that led to a whole lot of debate, a whole new level of debate here in the country. And one of the big things that I started to hear was that, maybe something bad will happen to our country if same-sex couples are allowed to marry. So there was a conservative journalist named Stanley Kurtz, who actually there's a University of Chicago connection. He used to teach here. He's trained as an anthropologist, but now is a journalist. And he made a big splash by writing about how not only might gay people change marriage, but in fact we have pretty good evidence that they've already destroyed marriage in several Scandinavian countries. And so he had an influential series of articles in a couple of publications that showed that non-marital birth rates skyrocketed, that heterosexual cohabitation skyrocketed over the time period where those countries were thinking about giving gay couples the right, actually not to marry, but to something close, like our civil unions, but they call it registered partnership. And certainly we continue to hear these kinds of claims, and sometimes they're not so very subtle. So in 2008, lest you think that we've learned something in the last 7 or 8 years, in 2008, as couples in California started to get married, Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council said, he criticized this ruling. He said, this ruling threatens to undo thousands of years of natural marriage, triggering 5 months of social chaos that could wreak havoc on every state in America. So I'm actually sitting in this very lovely apartment next to a canal in Amsterdam thinking, what am I going to write about? And I'm reading these kinds of things and I'm thinking, that's interesting. I don't know that that's really how I would interpret those demographic trends, but it's certainly very interesting. And then I started reading about, how other people on the other side were reacting to this, and it reminded me of Barney Frank. Barney Frank is an openly gay member of Congress, actually also from Massachusetts, and he tells a story about how what's going to happen if gay people can get married. And when the Defense of Marriage Act was passed in 1996, here's what he said: I'm going to try to do Barney Frank. Defense of marriage, it's like the old V8 commercial. As if this act didn't pass, heterosexual men all over the country would say, I could have married a guy. And then I'm reading in The New Yorker. The New Yorker's got this cartoon where this woman is packing up and she's walking out the door and her husband is just scratching his head saying, why are you leaving? And she says, it's not you, it's gay couples have hopelessly eroded the institution of marriage. That's why I'm leaving you, or something to that effect. So, we've got this very curious kind of debate in this country where on the one hand we've got people predicting the end of the world, and on the other hand, liberals kind of cracking jokes and scratching their heads. Nobody is really talking to each other on a very profound and important level, on a very profound and important kind of question. And as an economist, I wasn't really too sure that I could say very much about this. But there I was in the Netherlands, and I thought, I'm going to talk to some couples who got married and see what I can actually learn. And maybe start crafting a project that will talk about some of these big questions like, will gay people actually get married? And what I decided to do is to use Europe as a social laboratory, basically, to try to answer these questions. Will gay people change marriage? So I did interviews with Dutch same-sex couples. I looked at a bunch of survey data from the US and the Netherlands, and also did a demographic analysis of heterosexual decisions. The second question that comes up in this debate, which I will say less about today, is will marriage change gay people or LGBT people more broadly? And here again, I will talk a little bit about the Dutch couples data and some observations of the US and global debate within the gay community. And then finally, the other big thing that we started to hear in 2003 and 2004 was, whoa, we are moving way too fast here. This is judicial activism. What we need to do is to just do a little, experimentation, maybe give gay couples a few rights, but kind of wait and see exactly what's going to happen here. So there are a lot of people who are worried that change might be happening too fast in the US. Now, you will not see a whole lot of questions like this in economics journals. And what I realized pretty quickly was I was going to have to channel my old training from self-culture and society. What would Bert Kohler say about some of these questions? What would other people say about these questions? So I actually found that I had this great opportunity to actually try to do a little bit of real social science research. So I've actually started calling myself more of a social scientist than just an economist. This is not moving for some reason. What happened? Okay. So here's the first thing that I noticed, that a lot of the liberals were talking about something that was really different from what the conservatives were talking about. The liberals were talking about a verb. What happens when you get married? To marry. So that's the first angle I'm going to take. And then in a second, I'll bring back in the other side, which is how conservatives, I think, are mostly thinking about this issue, which is thinking about marriage as a noun, as an institution. Obviously, these two things are going to fit together, and I'll come back to that. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to just look at the choices that Dutch couples made about getting married or not, because again, this was still the only place where they could actually do that. And actually, here's the other interesting thing, is that in Holland, couples have lots of different choices. You can actually, if you are either a same-sex couple or a different-sex couple, you can simply live together, and the Dutch government will treat you as a couple for many important purposes. And one legal scholar estimated that about 70% of the rights and obligations of marriage goes just from living together. You can get a registered partnership, which is, again, like our civil unions. And that's, again, for either same-sex couples or different-sex couples. That was implemented in 1998. It was kind of the compromise on the way to what happened in 2001, which was when marriage was opened up to same-sex couples. So an interesting opportunity to see why people choose what they might choose. Now, I love Amsterdam. I think it's one of the most romantic cities in the world. Has anybody else ever been there? Yes, okay. So here's what you want to do. You want to picture yourself on one of these lovely bridges and one of these lovely canals. And I'm going to tell you a story about Liz and Pauline. This is the tale of three proposals. So the first time Liz proposed to Pauline, they were having a romantic evening in Amsterdam, and they were on one of these bridges somewhere, and Liz proposed to Pauline. Now, Pauline is thinking, oh, commitment, I'm a little worried about that, but I'm going to say yes. So she said yes. And then as soon as Liz heard yes come out of Pauline's mouth, she got cold feet and immediately backed out of the whole thing. Liz recovered from her indecision a little while later for the second proposal and proposed again. This time, however, Pauline said no. So why was that? Well, here's what she said. She said, I had the feeling it was more like a practical statement, so I didn't want it. And Liz admitted, that was only because I phrased it as a tax thing. Pauline said she wanted a romantic statement, and so that's why she said no. So it actually took them another year to get to the point where the third proposal was successful. So Liz finally tried again. Pauline decided Liz was in it for the right reasons, so that time she said yes. Now, I think this story kind of shows just how complicated this kind of decision-making is. And in fact, it actually kind of taps into a lot of our cultural understandings about the anxiety that people experience, the being left at the altar. How many movies have we seen made about the stresses that people experience when they decide to get married and go through that whole process? So thinking about why people get married, and thinking about whether gay people are getting married for the same reasons as straight people are getting married, I started out thinking about this as an economist. You could sort of think of this as a little cost-benefit kind of analysis here, where, assuming, given the characteristics that people bring to the table, their education and being of the right age and that sort of thing, and if they found somebody that they feel some love, some emotional connection to, then they might decide that the benefits of getting married, might outweigh some of the costs. So some of the benefits might be, making it easier to buy a house together or to have a child together. These actually are a couple of reasons. Even Dutch same-sex couples said they got married. So that legal framework is an important benefit to people. And there may be some, this stops sounding very economic pretty quickly, an expressive kind of value to stating your commitment to another person and to each other. But there may be costs. You maybe give up some freedom. You may have some disagreements with your partner that you have to bargain over and negotiate over. But assuming that all goes well, then if you decide the benefits outweigh the costs, then you're going to get married. Now, when I started talking to couples, the first thing most of them said to me was, "Oh, you're an economist. I'm really sorry, but economics had nothing to do with why we got married." So what did get in their decision-making process? It actually turned out to be a much more complicated kind of process that is very neatly summarized by this diagram here. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, don't worry. But I do just want to point out a couple of examples of how complicated this decision can be. And in fact, it starts off sounding a lot like the complications for different sex couples, but there are a few places where I think we see a few differences in the stuff that has to be negotiated by same-sex couples. And the biggest one really had to do with feminism. One of the big barriers for the lesbian couples in particular was the concern that they were buying into a patriarchal institution. And many, many of them said this to me. Fewer men said this, but some did. And so they had to find a way out. It wasn't just about deciding to get married or not, but they had to, in many cases, kind of change how they themselves thought about marriage. So here's a couple of examples. So one of them was Ellen. Ellen had just kind of in a romantic moment, decided that she wanted to get married to her partner. But it wasn't a romantic moment, oddly enough, where her partner was present. So that was a good thing, because Ellen at first was very conflicted about this. She said, first I had to convince my feminist part in me that maybe it's worth it to consider marriage. It's not for nothing I had this feeling, this romantic feeling. But it took me 3 months myself, without talking to anyone, just to find some kind of arguments to work with this concept to overcome her feminist opposition. And so finally she decided that getting married would be a way to honor the hard work that went into winning the right to marry in the Netherlands. And it would also be a way to push back against some of the conservative forces that she saw, actually not just in the United States. People did follow what was going on in the U.S. from the Netherlands, but also what was happening in her own country and in Europe more broadly. So that was her decision to get married despite her feminist concerns. Another feminist reconciled it this way. Well, the way to change marriage is to marry a woman as homosexuals. I don't think I would have ever married when I was with a guy. It would have been too traditional. But now you're breaking a tradition as well. So that was a way that she found a way around that. And then the last example I'll give you, gets very complicated. This is my powers of analysis were kind of stretched to the max on this one. So here's what I came up with. So this was an American, actually, who was living in the Netherlands with her partner. They call themselves love exiles, people who can only be together. They can't be together in the United States, so they have to move both together to the Netherlands. So her name was Laura, and her partner was Ria. So here's what Laura said. I really came of age in the 1970s in the second wave of the feminist movement. And to me, marriage just represented the subjugation of women, and it was about property. So I never in my life thought I wanted to be married, even if it had been possible. Now, I'll just point out Ria, her partner, did not share this opinion of marriage, but she just said, that's not really the sort of thing I'm bothered with. And Laura noted that Ria also views marriage a bit more sentimentally and more romantically. And she would love to get married and have a big party. But I have a problem with it. Who knows? We may get to that point someday, but I'm not there yet. So she's rooting her concern about marriage and that barrier of marriage as an idea, this feminist idea that she just couldn't quite get over. Or could she? Actually, Laura and Ria were registered partners. They had all the rights of marriage when I talked to them. And in fact, actually, they told me that the following week they were going to go to a lawyer and convert the registered partnership into marriage. So that doesn't quite fit with what she said. Remember, she said, well, who knows, we may get to that point someday, but I'm not there yet. So even though she had agreed to this appointment to do this, something really profound had to happen to get her to that point. So how can these things be reconciled? Well, I think it's interesting. I think what happened is that the way she kind of reframed the piece that she was most uncomfortable with was that it was the public part, the party. They didn't have a party. They just went to the lawyer to do this. So they weren't saying to the whole world, we're married, I'm married now. They could do that selectively. And so she was able to kind of see it her way. Rhea was able to kind of see it her way, which is a little bit different. The state kind of saw it their way. Their family saw it a different way. So everybody was able to get out of this decision to marry pretty much what they needed to. But as a couple, mainly, they each individually had to reconcile their concerns about that particular idea. So it is more complicated. Now, I would argue that that's actually it's not necessarily that different from what I've heard heterosexual feminists talk about in their own decisions to get married. But I think that mainly it comes out of partly this feminist ideology, but it also comes out of a history of exclusion. These are individuals who never, in many cases, never thought they'd have that opportunity to marry, and therefore that became part of their opposition to marriage. So I think what we're seeing is something that I'll come back to later, which is a little bit about how marriage actually might change gay people. But overall, what I conclude is that marriage is an act. If you look at marrying to marry, we don't really see any evidence of change. The reasoning that I saw for people getting married as same-sex couples was very familiar to what heterosexual people say are the reasons they get married. They're going to have a child, they have some practical needs, they're expressing commitment to each other, to their larger society, their families. There is some sense of making a political statement here, but this was never the main reason why people said they got married. It was something that just kind of existed alongside of it. And although, as an economist, maybe I was a little disappointed to hear that the benefits didn't really weigh in their analysis, that legal framework actually was very important in their decision to get married. Now, I'll just mention that I looked at the act of marrying from the heterosexual perspective as well, where we have pretty good demographic data, and tried to see what Stanley Kurtz was seeing in the data that led him to think that same-sex couples, the giving rights to gay couples was destroying the heterosexual institution. And in fact, I think he just made a very profound error, that all of the changes that had taken place that he was referring to actually began long before same-sex couples had any kind of rights in any of those countries. So there's actually a pretty long chapter in the book that kind of picks that data apart if you're interested in that particular question. We can certainly talk about that later. Here's another really interesting thing about the act of marriage that I think has a lot to tell us about what's going on here in the US, and that is the added value of marriage. You know, what's in a word? This is what we spend a lot of time debating in the US. Does it matter that same-sex couples get rights as civil unions or in domestic partnerships as opposed to getting the right to marry? And what the Dutch couples told me in several different ways was that marriage is much better, that they prefer to have the options to marry. And we see that in their actual decisions. If you count just the number of same-sex couples getting married in the Netherlands, it's much larger than it is the number of people getting registered partnerships. That's actually true in the US. I'll come to that in just a second. The couples that I talked to said they just saw that alternative when it was implemented in 1998 as simply a political compromise, and it didn't really, it basically just reinforced the idea to them that they were being seen as second-class citizens. And then finally, many of them said they didn't really think about this very much because, as one person called it, registered partnership, it's a bit of nothing. It's very dry. It's very businesslike. One couple who said that their decision was very emotional and spiritual were these two men, Otto and Bram. And they said it just didn't fit with registered partnership. Already, the name sounds very practical. You write, and you count, and you balance. That's how people saw registered partnership. So very few of the people that I spoke with chose it. Only one couple had actually chosen it when they had the option of both marriage and registered partnership. Now, here's the difference a word makes in the United States. This is from a study that I did with my Williams Institute colleagues. This is the percentage of same-sex couples who either married or entered a civil union or a registered partnership in the first year that was available. And what you can see is that marriage, and this is just Massachusetts at that point when we did the study, over a third of same-sex couples in the state chose to get married in that first year. In both states with civil unions and domestic partnerships, it's only around 10%. So it's a very different kind of choice that people seem to be making. And we see that not only in the Netherlands, but also in the United States. So it does look like marriage, the word, the idea, the noun, as we're getting to, is quite different from some of these alternative statuses, even though on a practical level they look very similar. And the difference is in that emotional content and the social signal that it sends. And it also differs in terms of what people actually get back from that people talk about getting married as something that other people understand. It is culturally intelligible to other people in a way that registered partnership simply is not. Registered partnership was invented in 1989 in Denmark. Marriage was invented when? A pretty long time ago. So there's a lot more that comes with marriage than with registered partnership. So let's talk a little bit more about that noun. So actually, this is probably the time to admit that actually there aren't that many same-sex couples, number one, in any of these countries that I've looked at. And not all of them do get married. So you might say, and actually many demographers say, oh, there's so few people who are actually getting married as gay couples that what difference could it possibly make? But, you know, marriage is a public act. And a lot of people might witness it. And it might be that that will be a kind of a leverage that could, in fact, change the institution of marriage in some ways. It's at least worth considering. So I spend a lot of time in the book thinking about this. And here's the way that I approach it. First, I'm thinking about marriage in terms of the way heterosexual people think about it, and thinking about whether lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are thinking about it in the same way, the ones that I talk to. And then thinking about whether gay marriages are actually recognized by heterosexuals as marriages in the Netherlands. So, like the decision-making process that I outlined earlier, same-sex couples that I talked to anyway, tended to think about marriage as an idea or an institution in the same kinds of ways that their heterosexual peers think about it. Now, this is an important phrase, as their heterosexual peers think about it, because marriage has actually changed quite a bit over time. Marriage used to be a social obligation. It was something that you had to do. It was a rite of passage. It created a family. It gave you license to have sex. There are all sorts of things that people think about marriage in a very traditional sense as doing. But in the last 50 years, marriage has changed enormously. It's no longer considered to be a social obligation. And it's clear that what same-sex couples are after is pretty much what the people who are heterosexual and getting married now are thinking about marriage as, which is an institution and a relationship that's about mutuality. It's not about having one person in charge. It's about thinking about the benefits of marriage that are mostly emotional, that aren't necessarily about having kids per se, or other kinds of more traditional benefits of marriage. And it's also not necessarily about having very strict roles for men and women. So the same-sex couples who say they don't want to simply adopt heterosexual gender roles, that they think about marriage as a political kind of institution that is always changing as other political and social trends influence it. Those are all things that reflect the fact that marriage has already changed. And in fact, there have been people like George Chauncey and some other people who've argued this, that heterosexual people are kind of moving to looking more like same-sex couples, and that probably same-sex couples wouldn't have wanted the right to marry had marriage been the old traditional, highly rigid kind of institution that it used to be, at least on a legal level. So same-sex couples, I think, by and large, are seeing marriage in the same way as heterosexual couples, that it's about commitment, it's about the emotional quality of the relationship. Now, do heterosexual people recognize gay marriages? This was very clearly a yes. And probably one of the best tests is to say, well, do mothers of lesbians and gay men in the Netherlands say to their sons and daughters, when are you going to get married? The answer to that is yes. Many of them do. I interviewed the youngest couple that I interviewed, Rachel and Marianne, decided to get married after they had dinner with Marianne's grandfather and grandmother. And the grandfather, all night long, was trying to convince them to get married. He said, why wouldn't you? You know, your grandmother and I, we've had this wonderful relationship for all these years. It's been a great thing. You have the right to marry. Why wouldn't you take advantage of it? And he convinced them. That's why they ended up deciding to get married. But the interesting thing is, as that story reveals, and as a lot of same-sex couples are realizing, marriage isn't something that's solely about two individuals coming together. That what people are entering into is something where there are a lot of other people who have opinions about, about what's proper and what is expected of couples. So one of the sadder stories that I heard was from Stephanie and Ingrid. In kind of stereotypical Dutch fashion, they were very frugal and went down to City Hall at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning to get married because it was free at that hour, because who wants to get married at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning? So they took their two witnesses down there and they got married, and then in a small romantic gesture, they decided to go out on their boat and have a little champagne and breakfast. And while they were doing that, Stephanie decided that she would call her father and tell him what happened. She thought, oh, he'll get a big kick out of this. And so she got out her cell phone and she called him and said, hey, guess what we just did? We just got married. And there was silence on the other end of the phone. And it turned out that her father was deeply hurt that she had gotten married and not invited him. Because in his opinion, what marriage was about having your family there to witness what was happening. And he was deeply upset, and she was stunned because he cried. He was so upset. And they had a rift that actually they were never able to completely mend before he died a few years later. So what that says to me is that that heterosexual people are seeing same-sex couples who get married as being just like different sex couples who get married. They want to be at that wedding. They want to have something to say about it. They want to help plan it in some cases. They participate in same-sex couples' weddings. They give toasts. They give gifts. Parents pay for those same-sex weddings. And they also treat the partner of their child as a member of their family in a way that in many cases they didn't do before. Not always. In many cases, these couples had been together for a long time. But a lot of these couples thought that their families were more accepting of their spouse as a result of this. And just as an example of that, a man who had gotten married also in that kind of unromantic way where they went down to City Hall and just quickly legally got married, didn't celebrate it, didn't have a party, didn't really tell very many people. So a year later, on their anniversary, he hears a knock at the door. So he goes to the door, and it's his neighbor. He has a cake and a card. He says, happy anniversary. And the guy who answered, the man who had married another man, was kind of dumbfounded. In fact, his partner was out of town. They weren't really having a party or celebrating it in any way. But his friends and neighbors were saying, what you did was important. It was important to us, and it's so important that we're going to acknowledge it and congratulate you to commemorate that particular day. So I think while not everyone has been as accepting in the Netherlands, by and large, there is a lot of evidence that heterosexual people are seeing same-sex couples as people who should get married and do get married. Now, this still posed a puzzle to me because it seems to me that something does have to change. If you go from a situation where same-sex couples can't get married to a situation where they can, something's got to change. Now, you might think, well, what do public opinion polls say? Well, actually, public opinion was very firmly in favor of letting same-sex couples get married, much stronger than it is here in the U.S., where it's still, hovering around the 50% level. But how is it even that changes? What is behind all of that? And I think what I came to understand might be happening is that, and this is my hypothesis really, that I hope to explore in some future work, is that people may be changing their ideas of what same-sex relationships are. Now, what do people think about same-sex relationships now? We haven't really studied that very much. But here's a couple of things that I've pulled out of my own network, and also reading memoirs and that sort of thing of people who've come out to their parents and thought about what that's like. So here's, maybe it's a sinful relationship that parents might tolerate just because they love their child and they want to retain that relationship even though they disapprove. Or it could be a close-term relationship a close relationship, this just a short-term casual cohabitation, kind of like a roommate, that was one of the euphemisms for a same-sex partner for a long time was her friend, my daughter's friend, or my son's partner, or roommate, always kind of in quotes, the air quotes. Maybe they thought about it as a long-term relationship that might last a very long time in their child's life, but might not exist past that child's life if the child were to die. But some parents are worried that their kids are in a relationship that won't produce grandchildren. So all of these are really relationships that are not about being in a family, I think. And what it seems to me that might be happening is that a child's marriage would clearly point to the spouse, the new spouse, as being someone who's not just in the relationship with a gay son or daughter, but is in fact now part of the wider family, the larger family. They're not a cohabiting partner, they're not a friend, they're not a best friend, they're not a roommate, they're a member of the family. And so this is what I think now may be one of the things that's at the heart of the anxiety about gay marriage in the United States, is this need to change how people see lesbian, gay, and bisexual relationships, same-sex relationships. And I borrowed this concept of a cultural schema from anthropologists. Cultural schema are cognitive structures that shape our social interactions. And what they do, how they function, is to help us solve recurring tasks. So who gets invited to family events? Who do you buy a Christmas present for? Who do you buy a birthday present for? What happens if your child dies? So defining somebody as a member of your family answers that question really clearly in ways that calling that person a friend or a roommate doesn't do. So I think what we're really facing is, in a much more profound way, that's been part of this change over time with regard to LGBT rights in general, but culturally it's changing how we answer this question about who is family. So this, as I said, is kind of the jumping off point for what I hope to do in the future. Now let me just summarize and say, so will gay people change marriage? My analysis, everything that I looked at suggests that there's not going to be a change in marriage. Behavior and intentions are similar. Marriages are recognized. The idea of marriage is the same for different sex couples and same-sex couples. Heterosexual people recognize the same-sex marriages as being marriages. And there's, just to kind of throw a little economics back in the mix, there's no real change in the economic institution either that has altered people's incentives to change their behavior. Heterosexual people face exactly the same incentives to get married or not as they did before same-sex couples could get married. So that's the big question that I wanted to talk a little bit about today, but I'll just throw a few little bits and pieces about the rest of it, the rest of the book, in case you're interested. So will marriage change gay people? And my answer is probably. It was hard to see a lot of changes in the couples that I interviewed, and I think some of these changes will take time to see. We know marriage, there's a long social science literature that has said that marriage makes you healthier, live longer, wealthier, all sorts of kinds of advantages that people get from being married. It's certainly made lesbians and gay men more visible, and that may be good in a larger way for changing attitudes about LGBT people more generally in lots of different kinds of contexts, not just the family context. It's going to change things for younger LGBT people who now have a new script for thinking about the course of a relationship that they might enter into, where marriage might be a point that they will be aiming for, or will create some kind of point that will require them to define what their relationship means. And one of the most interesting things that I just finished another paper using this data is that people experience, even if they don't get married actually, the same-sex couples that I talked to felt more normal. They felt included in the larger society in a way that they had never felt before. And they saw this as a very important marker of that inclusion that in itself could actually have long-term health and psychological effects. So what about the other question, the last question, are we moving too fast? Well, let me just tell you kind of quickly that the characteristics that define the European countries that offer same-sex, that offer either marriage or registered partnership to same-sex couples are actually not very surprising. They're less religious. They have more tolerance of homosexuality. They actually have more family diversity. There are lots more cohabitating couples in those countries than there are in the countries that don't have the recognition of same-sex couples legally. And there's pretty high gay visibility. So I had a little index of the density of gay and lesbian businesses and organizations that I used for this quantitative analysis. Let me just say that that first wave refers to the countries that enacted these laws in the 1990s. The interesting thing that's changing is that more religious countries are now actually also giving same-sex couples the right to marry. That's Spain, that's Canada. The UK actually even has fairly high religiosity, and Portugal, another Catholic country, is now soon going to be letting gay couples get married. So so that's Europe. So one way to gauge how fast we're going in the US is to look at those same characteristics here and see who's actually giving gay couples some kind of rights. And it turns out that those three necessary conditions for change, low religiosity, high cohabitation rates, and high tolerance of homosexuality, predicts that 20 states are above average on all those characteristics. And kind of breaking down the states that do recognize same-sex couples, most of them are on that list of 20. So they actually do a pretty good job of measuring the same forces of social change, I think, here in the US. I'll just tell you, Illinois is not on that list, just in case some of you live here, but it's pretty close. Where it falls a little bit short is actually in cohabitation rates. It's actually relatively low. It's lower than the average for the US as a whole, at least in 2000. We'll see what we come up with the 2010 census data. So that's really, that's the book. And just to kind of bring us back to economics just at the end again, in thinking about what's next here in the United States, I think we're continuing to see more states taking on these questions about whether to offer benefits to same-sex couples or some legal status and how to do that, what to call it. There is a lot of interest in economic arguments. So I spent a lot of time with my Williams Institute colleagues trying to quantify the possible fiscal effects on state budgets. It turns out actually it's a good thing for state budgets to let gay people get married. States save money. And it's good for local economies. We estimated about a $110 million boost in Massachusetts over the first few years. Actually, it's not a huge boost in economic activity. On the other hand, in a tough economy, every little bit helps. There is still an unfinished agenda for, even for those of us who live in states where same-sex couples are allowed to marry, and that has to do with federal benefits. The Defense of Marriage Act says even if Massachusetts and Iowa, Vermont, Connecticut, and New Hampshire will let gay couples get married, we're not going to recognize those marriages of same-sex couples. And as the sort of very last, kind of I'm going to bring it all the way home personally on this last slide. Here's my paycheck. So I'm married to a woman, and because of that, fortunately, she is allowed to be on my health insurance. But because the federal government does not actually recognize our marriage, I pay taxes on the value of those health insurance benefits. So although that $7,200 sadly didn't show up in my paycheck, I'm paying taxes as if it actually showed up in my paycheck. So we still have a ways to go before any same-sex couples in the US have the same kind of full rights of marriage that the couples that we talked about in the Netherlands have. And economics plays some of that role. On the other hand, I was in a debate with Maggie Gallagher a month or so ago where she said, if this debate, she's an opponent of gay marriage. She said, if this debate were just about benefits and economics, we would have figured it out a long time ago. That may be the one thing that she and I agree on. I think that what's much more important is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about in the book, which is about, why marriage is important to same-sex couples in a much broader way, not just an economic way, and how they are received in their larger cultural and social settings. So with that, I'm going to stop, and if you have questions or things you want to talk about, I'm happy to do that. Thank you.